talking today and in the future session about the end of childhood. That's a pretty decisively negative concept. There's a lot of negative things going around the globe right now, but this is one that I think deserves a whole separate focus. Childhood as we know it, as have we grew up in it, and as it has been in the recent past, the last century or so, is coming to an end. And it's coming to an end at both ends of the economic spectrum. And so we're going to have two sessions, one talking about the most deprived, and the other talking about simply standard child rearing. To talk about the most deprived, we're going to focus on something called the invisible child. The invisible child, which refers specifically to the 1.4 million homeless children in America who basically go unseen by nearly everybody. Andrea Elliott is a New York Times reporter, and she did a 5-part series in 2013 called The Invisible Child. And she followed up 8 years later with a book in 2021, and it won the 2022 nonfiction Pulitzer Prize. She follows the case of Dasani, an 11-year-old homeless girl who lives in a shelter with 7 siblings and her parents.
And named after Dasani water, for the thought that Dasani water was a privilege among privileged people.
And her mother's in that same vein. Her mother's name is Chantel. There are people who want to reach out to privileged America by taking their names.
Right.
Her mother's Chanel and her stepfather's named Roosevelt. And she cared for 7. She was the primary source of support for her mother and for her family and caring for her 7 siblings. I'm just going to read a brief description. The family lived in a single room at Auburn, a large homeless shelter in Brooklyn. Their clothes and mattresses forming a helter-skelter patchwork over the linoleum floor. The shelter's fire system was inoperable, the heat cut off in the winter, and the family daily battled mice and roaches. Kids swiped janitors' bleach bottles to scrub common bathrooms that went uncleaned. The staff failed to notify the police of sexual assaults. Mm. So that's not third world statistics. That's a place in Brooklyn that a child grew up in with her family. And what's the chances for that family? Chanel, the mother, she refuses government services for the most part, although Auburn homeless shelter is a government service. She steals things from Target and sells them. Roosevelt, the stepfather, cuts hair. They're built into the system. There's really no chance, seemingly, to escape poverty and the whole homeless system. Although, in fact, led by Dasani, they do emerge a little bit from that situation. We're going to focus on, because it's our mission, drugs and addiction and harm reduction. Chanel originally was involved in the crack trade. And it was a way of her making a living, and she became completely committed to crack. And now she went on to painkillers and to heroin. The interesting thing about Andrea Elliott, she doesn't use the term harm reduction. Mm-hmm. But she's very aware of the ups and downs of drug use. I'll give you three examples. She recognizes that Chanel sort of made a living and had a way of relating to the world through crack. She doesn't declare, like virtually everybody does, well, if she just got treatment, everything would be fine. In fact, Chanel and Roosevelt are required to go to drug treatment programs. Elliott doesn't comment on their effectiveness, but obviously they never escape using drugs totally.
Right.
They go up and down with that. And Elliott emphasizes how it really breaks into their daily ability to function, to go to these periodic treatment programs, and how in a way it contributes to their inability to crawl or paw their way out of their poverty trap.
Mm.
So she makes a treatment sound almost as an impediment. At the same time, because she's studying a family in its intimate detail, you become aware, and she becomes aware of the ups and downs of drug use. They're in a hole because they periodically relapse and test positive or are cited or arrested for some minor crime. And that kind of, their family surges and ebbs based on that.
It was interesting.
Quote again from the New York Times Review, within this entire framework, the family is a picture of chaos and love. When Chanel secures a housing voucher that subsidizes rent, the family moves into a Staten Island apartment with multiple bedrooms. But at night, the children drag their mattresses into the living room and sleep as they did in the shelter as one intertwined heap. Is that, I mean, that's so touching, isn't it? They have, their life is connected to one another. And what Elliott is really, the basic question Elliott is asking isn't, oh, how do drugs affect their lives? She's asking, how does this whole system work to maintain this group and the family, and in particular, Dasani. And Dasani offers kind of the one way out. She's a remarkable girl. She can do handstands and hand flips down the stairs. She's extremely verbal and intelligent and a quick study. And public school is a way out for her, although she has to disguise herself because she doesn't want everybody to know she's living in a homeless shelter, although probably everybody's aware of it. Somewhere along the way in this journey, Dasani gets admitted to the Milton Hershey School, which is in Pennsylvania. It's dedicated to 500 students like her to try and allow them to emerge from their poverty settings. But perhaps you can begin to see the dilemma that all of this presents. Dasani is the glue that keeps her family together. One reason she's so capable and self-confident is because she's, from the time she was a small child, she's been changing a younger brother's diapers and getting everybody off to school. She's been exercising this kind of competence. So what happens when she goes away? She actually thrives at the school, but the family falls apart without her. I'm quoting from the New York Times Review. Child Protective Services, which is an agency that overlooks the family and is supposedly guarding the safety of the children, bars Chanel from the family home, mainly on account of drug use. And so Chanel, the mother, begins sleeping outside. Having run out of food, Supreme grabs a new roll of paper towels from his apartment, heads to a nearby store, and tells the clerk, "I will kill you if you don't buy these paper towels." He's arrested. social workers send the children to 3 different foster homes. So Dasani has been given a leg out of all of this. She's the linchpin of her family, which in the terms that we would use is dysfunctional but critically connected to one another. And the family is split apart because Dasani is away. And Dasani blames herself. The family is loving. It's not a violent group of people, but violence appears periodically. Roosevelt does hit Chanel at some point. And Chanel punches a shelter caseworker in the face. So that's a serious crime. And meanwhile, partly because she's so distraught about what happened to her family, Dasani acts out in school and bloodies a girl's nose. And of course, the school has to consider expelling her. All of this is happening. While all of this is happening, out of their family love, Chanel is begging Dasani to graduate from Hershey. And so with good grades and behavior, that she can go to college on a scholarship. Chanel says, there's no home for you. There's no turning back. And yet, Dasani is given everything she wants at the school. They're trying to help her. But the one thing she craves the most, that's central to who she is her family. And so let's take a step back. Elliott calculates that hundreds of thousands of dollars are spent in a family, on the family annually. Yet, Child Protective Services is conceived of as protecting the child and not necessarily the family, which is the essential survival unit for the family, but certainly for Dasani. And Child Protective Services can't conceive of supporting this unit. I just want to take a step back. I'm primarily a psychologist, but I also got a law degree. And I worked as a public attorney in Morris County, New Jersey's court system in family court. And virtually all of my clients and all of the clients in that situation were placed there under the supervision of New Jersey's version of protective services around drug and alcohol use. And as a part of that, apropos of the points Elliott made, they're mandated to go into treatment and AA generally. Of course, it's nearly always going to be 12-step treatment. But there's no concept of how the family functions together and should be maintained. And of course, what Elliott is saying, which is not recognized in any of the reviews, is something really radical. It's a harm reduction message. Chanel and her, husband, Dasani's stepfather, shouldn't be taken from the family because of their drug use and their periodic relapses and their periodic arrests, because doing that completely eviscerates the one thing that maintains the family, and that gives Dasani the basis of her being. And so this isn't exact, Elliott outlines this, but this isn't exactly the point of what the book's about. The book's about Dasani and her family, but she's imagining a system predicated on the idea of support for a family in a harm reduction context that allows them to function and succeed in the best way that's open to them. And some of the members of that family, Dasani being the primary example, will then be able to leave that entire pit of like the Auburn public housing. It's not even public housing, it's homeless shelter, hell on wheels. And so, getting back to the title of the book, The Invisible Child, this is something, Auburn homeless shelter is actually near a kind of a modish growing area of Brooklyn. And periodically, Dasani would walk through that. But you can imagine the invisible child is, people are seeing her, but they have no idea. America has no idea of the existence of and the lifestyles of this group of 1.4 million American homeless children. And then the question becomes, how can we conceive of a system that allows the most vulnerable, meaning Chanel and Roosevelt, her husband, as adults, and of course the children, many of them are likely to fall into similar circumstances, to escape the worst consequences of drugs, death being the very worst, but complete disentanglement from American society and the chance of going forward. The book ends in 2021 on a note of hopefulness. The family does get a chance to live in an actual living unit, and Dasani is back on track for going ahead in her education. But of course, you get a terrible sense of dread and the possibility of all of this falling apart at any moment, because there's so little direct attention given to the maintenance of the basic unit of living that Dasani's family that's required to escape the worst consequences of drugs and total, as you know, as the Times Review describes it, the chaos of their lives. In our next session, we're going to talk about something that occurs more often at the other end of the economic spectrum, that's destroying childhood and the chance for children to emerge as real successful adults. And we call it Munchausen syndrome by proxy, as a mode of raising children now for middle-class Americans.
I haven't read the book yet, but I found these pieces in the New York Times that Elliott wrote fascinating. And of course, I think that Dasani was an exceptional human being, but her situation clearly was not exceptional in the sense that it was rare. And she notices this thing that what we're doing right now, we have an alphabet soup of agencies that are created, I guess, when each situation arises that seems like it needs an answer. Well, there's a new, organization that arises, and none of them are talking to each other, and certainly none of them have a family systems approach to dealing with human beings, and certainly none of them have a fundamental cultural approach to dealing with human beings. And so what we're left with, from an overarching organizational standpoint, is we're looking at a way of life, humans with the way of life. And for better or worse, that way of life is ubiquitous. This situation is ubiquitous in certain pockets of America. And we're saying, each time a situation like this arises, can we continue to sweep it under the rug somehow? And then we can just live our normal lives, our quote unquote normal lives. And what she's saying is Dasani and her family and people like them, people that they represent, are part of the warp and woof of our culture. And so we have, you said it perfectly. She almost imagines a system. She doesn't know what exactly it looks like, that incorporates all of those things that she said, including well, there was a quote crack epidemic, but then again, if you look at it through this kind of the lifestyle of these people, that was a way of avoiding certain kinds of systems that are meant to help them but actually oppress them, lifting themselves up. And the only thing that they really had to worry about is the systems themselves. They hoped that they didn't interact with them. And the same thing with Dasani going to school. And I actually deal with this when I was working with high school kids. I dealt with this a lot, and maybe a different kind of a way, but people who would become successful, or people who were very intelligent, would often be challenged with this one leg and two camps kind of a thing going on, where either they had family left behind that either they said, oh, aren't you just brilliant? Don't you just think you're something? They almost were shamed into being successful or having achievement-oriented kind of goals. Or on the other hand, people had a difficult time finding success, especially when it was the kind of success like a scholarship or something gifted to them that wouldn't necessarily leave behind their family in the way that you described. And of course, family, especially to people in this sort of an upbringing, is the most essential part of their being. So we'll leave that as food for thought. What would it look like to create a country, a system that incorporated all of those things for better or worse without having to close our eyes to them or, choose a different path to walk around when we're dealing with these people. These are people in our country, in our community, who we'll need to contend with, and we should hope can be successful as families and on their own.
And our motivation for doing so is the consequences we see all around it. The drug death toll rising over 100,000 annually, and all the people that, fall short of death, but are in that same mix. At the same time, we bemoan all of those things. That's why we have to have a radical reconception of all of these systems and family support systems and harm reduction and drug addiction. And
the series of articles that you serialized in the New York Times, was it called The Invisible Child? And that was the namesake of the book?
Well, that was back in 2013. The Invisible Child she followed it for 8 more years, and she wrote a book in 2021 called The Invisible Child.
So I'll link to those things because I think it's...
right. The original series wasn't called The Invisible Child yet.
Okay, got it. Well, thank you, Stanton. Let's move on to part 2, talking about these same issues in a different milieu. I appreciate your time.